Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I am your host for this week, William White, and with me, as always, are Tiffany Liu, hey Tiff, and Kensho Watanabe. Sup, brah? This week, we'll be discussing the recent collapse of Columbia Artist Management, Inc., and what it means for the classical music industry. Then we'll review Dan Brown's new classical music children's book, Wild Symphony. And finally, we'll talk about the curious case of Keiko Yamada. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Kensho, what do we have today?
So we played Game of Pairs last week, and we have a new game for you this week called Two Truths and a Lie. Okay, here's how this works. I have chosen 3 musical excerpts, all ostensibly by the same composer. But in a rather sinister ploy, I have in fact chosen one excerpt that is not by the composer at all. My lovely co-hosts will listen to these 3 excerpts and try to discern which gives lie to the following statement. This week's excerpts are all by Claude Debussy. But before we get to the excerpts at hand, let's discuss what makes Debussy sound like Debussy. What do you guys think?
Well, I personally love that you chose Debussy this week because just earlier this summer, I read a great biography of Claude Debussy called Claude Debussy, Painter in Sound. And to me, that gets to a lot of what makes Debussy sound like Debussy. He's a very poetic composer. He's a composer who can write amorphous sounding music that usually has some kind of a concept behind it, either poetic or visual. He's known as an impressionist composer, but he sort of eschewed that moniker. So I'm listening for ethereal harmonies. I'm listening for music that's hard to exactly put your finger on.
Anything that Debussy writes for me has is suffused in this feeling of light. He was very interested in trying to portray light in music, the feeling of light. And it's really all about the way the surroundings of it feel. So for me, you're often going to have a hard time identifying concrete melodies, things that you would walk away whistling to yourself. You're not going to find a ton of those in Debussy, although he does come up with a few here or there, but they're fleeting. You come upon them, you wonder at their beauty for a while, and then they disappear. So that's sort of what I think when I hear of the sound world of Debussy.
So let's get to the first excerpt. And here is excerpt number 2. And here's excerpt number 3. All right, so here are the 3 excerpts, all of them presumably by Debussy. Tiffany, first thoughts?
This is hard.
Kensho is devious. We've known this about him.
I'm almost positive that I'm going to go with my guess in terms of who is not by Debussy, which one is not by Debussy. It's going to be either 1 or 3, because I'm pretty sure number 2, that's right in there with everything that I know about Debussy, from the whole tone scale and then the movement of the key areas that happens about maybe I think 10 seconds into the excerpt. And the last one is quite virtuosic, right, compared to the other 2. I have this feeling of maybe that's Ravel, because that has to me the kind of the sparkliness that a lot of Ravel's piano music has. That's not to say that Debussy didn't write really virtuosic keyboard material, but in terms of the repetition, the ostinato that's happening, that all reads to me a little bit more like Ravel potentially. So those are my initial thoughts. I'm still a little bit unsure as to whether I'll go with my guess of number 1 or number 3. What about you, Will?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Ravel, because that would be the obvious dupe in here.
Right, the red herring.
Yes, because Debussy was very influential on Ravel, who was about a half generation younger, and their styles shared many similarities. I mean, Debussy became a very influential composer on French music in general. My guess is actually number two. Number two had a very Spanish style to it. And that is something that, though Debussy was interested in Spanish music, I think Ravel was more interested in Spanish music. So when I hear that little glimmer of Spanish sounding music, that sort of clues me in. Number three had a little childlike melody. And that is very Debussy to me, short little melody fragments that work that way. So I'm pretty sure that number three is Debussy. And number one is a piece that I recognize. So I'm going with number two.
Well, I suppose that leaves me with either no choice but to completely go with what Will is saying or to pick my original instinct of number three. So I suppose I'll go with number three.
Very interesting. Actually, I love hearing you guys reason it out a little bit. Obviously I picked something, especially the difference between 2 and 3 are very, very similar. So without further ado, let me reveal the lie. The lie was number 2. Now, yes, considering number 2, Will, who would you guess wrote number 2?
I would guess Ravel, but I would think that there are other possibilities who might include De Falla.
Albéniz, possibly?
Albéniz, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't surprise you if it were another French composer or a Spanish composer.
That would be my guess.
Speaking.
I mean, if the Impressionist movement had a home, musically speaking, it was France, and then with a very specific kind of flair, Spain.
So would it surprise you if I said that the composer of number 2 is in fact American?
Oh.
Wow.
This
Kensho.
piece is from Charles Griffith's
Nice.
Tone Pictures, and this is the third movement, The Night Winds.
Wow, no, that I never would have guessed.
That's awesome.
So yes, apologies for quite a sadistic way of playing this game, but I just found it to be so interesting. Charles Griffiths, as we know, but maybe many people probably don't know the composer, is an American composer who was very much influenced by the Impressionists and wrote very much in this style. And an interesting tidbit as well about Charles Griffiths is that he died of influenza in New York during the 1918 pandemic.
And tell us what the other two were, just so that we have a...
Yes. So the first excerpt, of course, was by Debussy, and it's from his Image, Book 1, and it's Reflections in the Water. And then the third one was from his Preludes, Book 1, and the title of that is The Wind in the Plain. So both 2 and 3 dealt with wind and started on the same pitch and very much sounded like Debussy. All right, well, that concludes our Prelude segment of the week. And I'm going to toss it over to Tiffany for our first topic.
So the topic that I'd like to bring to the table today is the recent collapse of Columbia Artist Management, Inc., along with other management companies in this whole pandemic situation. And this is very recent news as far as our world is concerned, right? The final last day of Columbia Artist Management, Inc., which we will refer to now as CAMI, C-A-M-I, that was only as recent as August 31st. That was the final day of operations. And that was after 90 years of representation of classical music artists and this veritable domination of the artistic management scene. In their press release, they cite a prolonged pandemic environment and other financial insolvencies. The roster of artists listed on their website now is, of course, depressingly blank, but just to give you all listeners a taste of how much of a hole this leaves in terms of artist representation and management, some of the banner artists of their former roster include conductors Seiji Ozawa, Valery Gergiev, and Mirga Grazinte-Tyler, singers Isabel Leonard, Russell Thomas, and Brenda Ray, and pianist Maurizio Pollini. So what does this mean for the world of classical music? And what does it mean for an artist to have management in the first place is actually maybe an interesting way to get into this conversation. And to direct that conversation, I'd love to ask those questions of Kensho, who is a managed artist. What is your experience working with management? What is the point? What do they do for you? And from that perspective, what is this news going to do to our world?
Yeah, I'll speak to my experience as a young conductor being managed, because I think that's a very niche area.
Definitely.
When we talk about the Ozawas and the Gergievs and the Mirigas, those are people that can really find themselves through the industry without having management in the same way that I do. So my relationship with Askenas Holt, my management company, is really for the company or the Askenas Holt to make sure that my name as a conductor is recognizable in as many orchestras as possible. That's one part of it. The second part, and I think is probably the more critical one, is as a young conductor, there's a certain way of charting the course in your development as a conductor as you gain more repertoire and you gain more experience and you progressively get to conduct bigger orchestras, more well-known orchestras, more high-pressure, high-stakes situations, and how to kind of build up those experiences and really forming a partnership with your manager to get to those points, those kind of landmark points throughout your career. With that said, in terms of my reaction of Cami closing, of course, there's a lot of support staff that's in that company that now are left jobless. So I really think about those people immediately. And further than that, I also think about the younger conductors like myself on that roster, because I think that's where the Ozawas and the Gergievs, again, the Mirigas, will find some way of having management.
They're going to be fine, right?
They're going to be okay. Obviously, it's a little bit of a dust up in terms of who they can contact at this moment, but they'll be okay. But for the people that have just signed with Cami or just signed over the last 2 years, and they're again trying to chart this course for themselves as they grow through the industry, that's a big loss there until they can kind of find that management again. So that's my initial reaction of things.
Yeah, when I see this happening, of course you think it's very rough turn of events for the people who rely on this as a source of income, as their career, the people who are working in the staff. And then you also think, okay, well, what phoenixes are going to arise out of the ashes here? If we look at this through a lens of like creative destruction. So some of these bigger managers who work under this company's label can probably start putting together boutique houses and operations. They can take their clients with them. I mean, I've already seen this announced that, there are some artist managers who are setting up their own shops. But so, I mean, Kensho, if I can turn this back to you, since you know much more about this than I do, since Cami was at the top, does that leave room at the very top for then some other major worldwide artist management firm to take that seat at the top and to expand?
Well, to be fair, I think that Cami isn't just this one huge whale that just went away and there's no one else that were major players already. I would say that IMG and Opus 3, there are many other like reputable things. And heads up, guys, there are a ton of conductors out there. So you can look at you look at Cami's roster of conductors. I know it's a lot, but then you look at IMG's roster of conductors and you're going to see some big names there. You can just look at Opus 3's roster and there's going to be some big name conductors there as well. So it's not to say that this is like one big agency fell away and something's going to rise. I think that a lot of them are kind of similar tiers. And Cami is mostly US based. I know they have some other European offices, but it's a US based firm. So I wouldn't say something would take over a monopoly of artists and conductors. I think they're actually pretty evenly distributed across many of the major agencies.
I came across an article which said, well, this is going to have kind of trickle down effects on the rest of the field. And the first to feel that in a negative way, it seemed to imply, this article, would be a company like IMG. And that sort of made me question, right? Because what you seem to be asking, Will, is whether there might be, in fact, windfalls for other smaller or on par organizations. But in fact, maybe closer to what Kensho was saying at the beginning of our segment here, is that there's a global effect for the entire field that is in fact, negative. It's not just all capitalist rushing in to fill the void and making the best of something that is now in market openings.
Kensho, there was something else I wanted to ask you about the structure of these organizations from the viewpoint of a young artist. Can you talk about how large management companies are able to leverage their top talent as a way to promote and expose their younger talents, their lesser known names?
I'll talk about just in terms of how it pertains to conductors. Let's say one of their artists that are a little bit more experienced lands a music director position in an orchestra. In those discussions, the manager that represents, say, another artist that's younger may suggest putting their younger conductor on one of their seasons or giving their debut with that orchestra, given the familiarity with the music director and because of the same agency and the same manager, that conversation will happen.
So we'll call managers sort of cross-pollinators in a sense, right, of the field, where they go around and they are shedding these references of people who are mostly on their own roster. You know, that's how the business works. But I have to imagine that there's some sort of communication between the agencies as well. What I wonder now is, and there's not a binary answer to this question, but in an age where most of us are being taught to be all-in-one artist. So, manage yourself, publicize yourself, make your own website, promote, get backstage, meet people yourself. Is being managed more or less, I'll cautiously use the word necessary. If you want to reach a certain level of success, is being managed a matter of course? And then maybe by the by, Kensho, like, what is interaction with a management or manager like? Like, do you talk every week? Do you talk every night? Like, what's the shape of the relationship there?
I think it really depends on each artist, but I'll just speak from my own experience, because this was actually a really interesting educational experience when I first started with Asking the Soul, because that's exactly the question that I had when I first signed with them. I was kind of like, okay, so now I'm with Asking the Soul and I have to manage with Terry. Do I call him now, or do I need to wait the appropriate days, after the first date to, make sure you have a little time.
You just text afterwards, what's your game? Yeah.
We developed a time where, if there wasn't much happening, we would maybe check in once a month. And that became one of those things where it felt like too long of a time for me. So I actually requested that we talk bi-weekly. Mm-hmm. So every other week we would just check in. And it could just be as short as a 15-minute phone call, but just to kind of talk and say, okay, what's going on? And that's actually what we've been doing during this pandemic too, when obviously there's not much happening, but just to check in with each other.
Tiffany, like you as an unmanaged artist, I wonder if you've heard this before, but the one big piece of advice that I've gotten about artist management is don't just sign with the first artist manager who offers to manage you. It can be more detrimental to have a bad manager than not to be managed at all. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a manager who's not really working for you, then you're in a situation where it's totally up to you to line up your own gigs, but then your manager is just going to take 10 to 20% of your fee.
Right.
And they might, one thing that a manager does is to negotiate a higher fee on your behalf. And so they might negotiate that higher fee, but you might end up with the same amount of money that you would have otherwise, because all they have done is negotiate basically their own portion of that. And I think it also comes back to the question that you asked, is it necessary to have a manager to attain a certain level of success? And of course, success is a totally subjective concept. Is it necessary to have a manager to attain a certain level in the classical music or opera industry? Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably. Because you just don't get those meetings. You don't get brought to the attention of the big machers, mm-hmm. The power dealers in the industry without those inroads. But to have artistic success and to have a gratifying career path, you don't necessarily need that. And especially if you are good at developing your own relationships and keeping in contact with people and finding people who are supporters of yours and who are willing to come back to the well and who know what you do and want to interact and work with you, then to have a successful and fulfilling career, you don't necessarily need a manager.
So one thing that is a theme among what all three of us have said today is it's not just about, are you paying somebody to represent you, but there's actually a relationship that's going on there. And when we look at an organization like Cami and that they failed, and there are people behind there who are now out of jobs, and there's a whole community of artists surrounding them, not least their friends and family members, but other people in the artistic community that are going to feel the effects of this as well. And we'll keep abreast of anything that comes along that might be of interest to discuss in the wake of this event. But thanks for all your insights. On a lighter note, Will, what's our second topic?
Dan Brown is the author of such blockbuster hit novels as Angels and Demons and The Da Vinci Code, which have collectively sold over 200 million copies worldwide. He's now released Wild Symphony, a book of children's poetry featuring a menagerie of wild animals. But what's interesting from our perspective is that the book was released in tandem with an album of symphonic music that Brown himself composed. Let's have a listen to one of these tracks. This one is called Bouncing Kangaroo. Okay, before we get into this topic, a disclosure and a disclaimer. The disclosure is that I myself am currently involved in a project with Parma Records, the recording label that put out the Wild Symphony album. So take that for what it's worth. And I suppose I should also mention that I myself am in the classical children's content racket. So while I moderate this discussion and share some of my own experiences, I'll avoid opining specifically on the quality of Dan Brown's piece. And the disclaimer to keep in mind as you listen to our discussion is that none of us are parents, but as young or youngish, in my case, conductors, we are all rather experienced in presenting classical music to children. So Tiffany, we read this book and we listened to the album and we even interacted with the app. What was your takeaway? You're a Dan Brown fan. What did you think? Is this what you expected?
Fan is a little bit of a strong word. I have read and enjoyed his books in the past, but I don't know if I was surprised or not. I mean, it seemed like it had the right combination of all the elements. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about like the specific features of the book, but I loved that, for example, there was an app that you could download that went along with the book, which you could hold up to your camera to any of the pages in the book, and it would start playing the appropriate matched piece that had been composed for the animal that was being featured on that particular page. So things like that. I mean, I thought the integration of the whole experience between word and illustration and music was actually quite seamless. And that was, I think, the thing that struck me the most. Of course, beyond the inherent cuteness of the topic and the animals that were discussed, I mean, the themes were adorable, I thought, and had a lot of musical relevance as well.
Right, and we should mention here that the illustrations in the book are by Susan Bátori, who is a Hungarian illustrator. Kensho, what did you think of the music in particular?
This is the part where I was really interested because I did not know that Dan Brown was a composer and had all this musical training beforehand. And I actually quite enjoyed the music. It was interesting that the clips of the music were longer than what it would take to read the page of the book. So we should also mention that we had bedtime story with you, Will. So we were kind of simulating what a parent would do in terms of reading to their kids. Tiffany and I were Will's children for one evening as he read us this book with the cell phone app. But it was interesting that it would play out a little bit longer than what it would normally take to read the book as well. I would say my favorites were The Ray and The Anxious Ostrich. Those were the two that I enjoyed the most.
Yeah, in a way, to do a proper rendition of this book musical experience, you would need to rehearse it a little bit. You know, if I had practiced ahead of time, I could have stretched to fill. And you could hear that there were places in the music that were specifically referential to certain lines of the poetry, you know, that talked about little sounds or little events happening. So here's a question for either of you. Could you imagine this working in the concert hall?
I could imagine it working. I mean, content-wise, I think it's pretty good. It has kind of these nice focused themes and sort of morale. It has a distinct feature of a very sweet assortment of animals, not the first 10 you'd think of maybe. We've got the manta ray, I thought was actually one of the more imaginative ones, but we also have a chorus of frogs. We've got armadillos. So I think it would work pretty well. Where I question how well it would do in the concert hall is that the music was written, even though it has specific dramatic events that correspond with particular words, it's clear to me, or at least it was in our experience of the book, that the music was sort of a backdrop to what you were saying, Will. And so for that reason, it doesn't feature the music enough for me to want to have it as the children's concert, because for me, when I program a children's concert, I want the music to be as interesting as possible, as focal as possible.
I will say, though, that there are moments where the music echoed the text or
Definitely.
kind of reflected on that. And I find that to be the most powerful element of a children's or a family concert is if we do have a narrator, if the music can respond to some of the speech in an organic way so that the kids can see that there are depictions that can be possible through the live instruments that some of them have never seen before. Also, I love the depictions of animals holding the instruments toward the end that they kind of like fold out. And so I'm imagining some visuals, right? Like, and again, I think the total album running time is 36 minutes. So it's not out of the question to do all of it, but we could select a few that have that kind of interaction between speech and music and also have some visuals. And then there's that Maestro Mouse moral of each animal story, right? There's always like this kind of like very
summation of the
usually something, you know, about morals or something like this, where that could be something that is held up on a sign by the conductor or something. I don't know. You could be the, you know, you could dress up as
you could imagine a sort of semi-staged version which would actually have the music talking to other actors possibly on stage. You could bring in easily other costumes possibly. And what I actually loved about the material itself, like the text, was that a lot of it did seem to come from a fundamentally musical place. There's aspects of, when you're really stressed, it's okay to take time for yourself. And then the music is like singular and kind of introspective. You know, it doesn't read to me in the way that many children's books have in the past. And I think this is purposeful on Dan Brown's part, where the summation moral, we'll call it a moral in this case, but actually I think it's closer to like a self-care guide. And it's sort of a help book for children to see that the things that they feel are valid. And the reason that they know those things are valid is actually because we find those truths fundamental in music. That's the starting point. So that is actually what I find the most endearing thing about the material in this book.
And there's so much potential with this app, right?
That's
the fact
right.
that there's an app already, that it could be something where there's a section of the app that says you're about to experience it live. And then there could be an interactive portion that is fed through the app during the live performance. Dan Brown, if you're listening to this, please give us credit for that idea. Thank you.
Well, that is one thing I will chime in and just say about the experience of it is that the app works seamlessly. They've got the tech down. And I think that one of the big successes of this is that the app does one thing and one thing only. You point your phone at the page of the book and it starts to play the music for that page. It's not trying to be a distraction. It's not trying to be a social network. It's not trying to like swindle you out of your hard-earned money with all of these in-app purchases that some little kid might accidentally stumble upon. All it does is play the music that's appropriate to the page that you're looking at. And so I think that that's something that I really appreciated about this. So Kensho, can you maybe talk a little bit about what else is out there in terms of educational content for children based around classical music?
But in my experience of doing a few of these children's concerts and family concerts and this, I would say that there's very much a lack of quality content for kids, especially for these major orchestras that if they have somebody in the education or outreach department that is very much interested in creating original content that the orchestra puts its name on, then you can have some really creative discussions about how to formulate those concerts and use the repertoire. Most of these orchestras will just get a kind of a stock already made program for students. So one of the examples is Carnegie Hall has a program for education concerts called Link Up.
Link Up, yeah.
And
have you ever done one of those? Because I have a lot of friends who have done them and they speak very highly of them, but I've never done it myself.
I absolutely hate these things. I'm sorry. Sorry to Carnegie Hall. And I think it's also just in terms of knowing the environment in which these things are being performed, because I think for Carnegie Hall, when they started this Link Up, it was for their kind of community fellows that perform in smaller ensembles in school classrooms and smaller spaces. And when this is taken to a major hall like Verizon Hall in Philadelphia, where we have 2,700 seats and it's a big hall and the kids are seated pretty far away from the orchestra, it doesn't necessarily lend itself. So a lot of the basis of Link Up is some kind of interaction between the audience and the orchestra. So sometimes the audience will sing along to a piece that the orchestra is playing or play recorder to a piece that the orchestra is playing. But when the recorder kids are 1,000 feet away from the stage, how much interaction is there? And are they really gaining any kind of experience by playing with the orchestra so far away on stage? So there's some issues with that. And I also have some issues about how much watering down or making the music that they select easier to discern, which I don't agree with. I think that music is music and they, kids can experience it the way they want. So there are some issues with it that I found to be kind of frustrating in dealing with that. So this is why I say that there's not much great content for at least bigger orchestras and bigger halls presenting education programs.
Yeah, but that sort of raises the question: is a large hall, 2,000 seat auditorium, is that the best setting in which to introduce young kids to the joys of classical music? To me, the fault there might not be with the creators of the content; it might be with the presenters who chose this content, which is by and large inappropriate for their project. And maybe their project is not appropriate at all. I mean, I personally think that if you want to get kids interested in music, you have to bring it down to a human level.
I have been part of efforts to connect the Link Up concerts in specific to more cellular dispatches of musicians to schools and hospitals and these kinds of things. And what I will say is that the reason that Link Up is so highly spoken of generally is that they recognize that the investment for these projects starts way before the concert itself. And that activities that they pass out, in the weeks leading up, that hopefully teachers and parents or whoever, are reinforcing or starting to introduce to the kids, which, I mean, honest to me, like the recorder thing seems like, like when I want to be stuck in an auditorium full of, 1,000 recorders, I'll let you know, but not today. But the idea is that there is a shared responsibility of introducing kids to this content. Will, you've had some experience doing this in the past, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, we've actually worked together on some of the material that you've written, your own Carnival of the Animals. And I remember that you also wrote a piece about a budding composer with a story embedded in it.
When I approach it, I try to remember how I got into classical music in the first place. And to Kensho's point about wanting music that interacts with narration, that interacts with story, that is integral to it. That's what I've always tried to do. So I've written a couple pieces. I did one called Cinderella Goes to Music School. I did one called How to Become a Composer. And both of these have characters in a story, in a narrative, that are musicians. That's how I linked this to the experience of the music that they were hearing. So it's music, it's stories about music and about musicians. I also wrote a piece called The Itsy Bitsy Spider and His Great Sing-Along Adventure.
I love that.
Thank you, Kensho. Now, this I thought was going to be my big break into this world because, I mean, it's a sing-along piece. It's a story that sort of weaves together these different nursery rhyme songs in such a way that it's punctuated with these points where the whole audience gets to sing along. And, I thought that this was going to be a big hit, but I have to say it has been really hard to penetrate the market with this. One big challenge has been I don't have any visual component to go along with this. I don't have a book. And shortly after I wrote this, I investigated finding an illustrator and trying to get a publisher for this as a book because it would work great as a book. And I reached out to a friend of mine who has published YA literature. And she told me that children's literature is the hardest field in the publishing industry to break into. That is where there is the maximum amount of content in comparison to any other publishing endeavor. And I was really surprised by that. So then I looked into trying to find an animator to get to do some kind of a video animation for this piece. Well, to find an animator, even like a student who's in like art school, it's still really expensive. I mean, it's more money than I had as the publisher of my own music to sink into this project. So all I can say is, in a manner of summation, is that this is a hard racket to get into. It's hard to create good content, but one thing that I do appreciate is that I like that the app is not too interactive. I appreciate that it's a listening experience. I love that narrative musical storytelling that forces the children or forces anybody to live inside the theater of the mind. So I commend Dan Brown and his team for doing that. And I hope that is something that we see more of in the future. Less focus on everything having to be animated, having to be illustrated, more focus on creating auditory listeners and active listeners and auditory learners out of young minds and getting them engaged that way. So before we wrap up on this topic, I would like to mention that we are doing a drawing. I got my own copy of Dan Brown's Wild Symphony, and now that's just going to sit on my bookshelf. So I thought that it would be a much better use of that particular entity to help promote our podcast. So what we'd like to put out to you is that if you follow us on Facebook or Instagram and you post about the podcast, we will enter you into a drawing to win your own copy of Dan Brown's Wild Symphony. We will reach out to you once we see that you have posted about us, and we'll get in touch with you and make sure that you get your copy. So once again, please, to enter into the drawing for the giveaway of Dan Brown's Wild Symphony, follow us on Facebook or Instagram and post about the podcast, share it with your friends. Hey, you know what? Even if you want to send an email to your friends and CC or BCC classicalgabfest@gmail.com. Email is an undervalued source of social media, I say. So go ahead and do any of those things, and we will enter you to the competition to win your copy of Wild Symphony by Dan Brown. Okay, Kensho, what is this doozy of a third topic that you have for us today?
In September 2019, Jennifer Jolly published an article on New Music Box titled The Curious Case of Keiko Yamada, telling the story of Larry Clark, an award-winning composer of music for educational ensembles who, in 2004, curiously began publishing compositions under the pseudonym Keiko Yamada in a self-described Japanese style. Over the next 12 years, Clark/Yamada released such pieces as Tsunoyama, Japanese Lullaby, Sakura Sakura, and I wouldn't even say my favorite, but quite offensively, Japanese Hoedown. If this wasn't troubling enough, during this time, Larry Clark was also serving as vice president and editor-in-chief for Carl Fischer Music, a major publisher of educational music, including Clark's own compositions. When Clark was outed as Keiko Yamada, he issued a statement of apology on his Facebook page stating, "It has been common for composers and authors to use pen names for centuries. Times obviously have changed, and I realize that the use of this pen name was uninformed, insensitive, and out of touch with the need for diversity in music," close quote. But Jolly and we are left wondering, is that enough? Will, initial thoughts?
Well, my first thought about this is just that I would commend our listeners to read this article because it is incredibly good. Jennifer Jolly is somebody who I have had a little bit of interaction with, and I know that she's a spectacular musician and a wonderful composer, but I didn't realize just how good of a writer she was. And what I love about what she does in this article is she is very good at a very basic reporting level. She follows the facts, she finds where they lead, she gets an interview with Larry Clark himself. So she starts with a Facebook post and she documents how she then follows that trail. The other thing that I think that she does that's really great is that she documents her emotional response to the various facts as she is coming across them. And then the third thing that she does is the centerpiece of this article, which is the interview that she does with Larry Clark. And I think that she did such a great job of probing him on his actions, even if she doesn't get the answers to everything that she's really curious about. So that's just where I want to start. And of course, we will link this in the show notes for this podcast episode. The big question at the heart of this is, why did he do it? And at the beginning of the article, she posts this Facebook post that says that he did it in response to a call for increased diversity in music. But we don't really find out if that's right. Tiffany, could you wrap your mind around why he actually did it? Did you think that it was because of an increased focus on and a desire for more diverse voices in music education? Or was it something else? Could you see through the miasma here to kind of parse out what he was after?
When we are forced to account for our actions, especially ones that we are regretful of, it's often hard for any of us, right, to piece together exactly what the thought process were. And this is where we're seeing a lot of public apologies fall short, is in this way of reconstructing, okay, exactly where did I go wrong? And can I explain that to somebody in a way that satisfies the folks that I've hurt? And he's quite frank, I feel, in the article about acknowledging that he has done a bad thing, right? He's not coy, I don't think. So if there's difficulty discerning exactly what his motivations were and when, it's not my feeling based on what I saw of the interview that that's because he's trying to hide nefarious intentions, although the intentions themselves probably came from a fairly selfish place. So with that kind of disclaimer, I would say, he says, I did this because I felt, all a composer ever wants is for their music to get played, right? That's it from a very fundamental standpoint. If you write a piece, you would like to increase its possibility of it being picked up. And so when he sensed that the current was turning towards a place that might allow the pieces that he was writing at the time under the pen name Keiko, or under what was become his pen name Keiko, Yamada, I do think that was from a place of, oh, I think people are more likely to perform my music if I publish it under a pen name. I do think that that's where it came from.
He is quoted in the interview as saying that, while I was known as a band guy, and I'm paraphrasing here, I was known as a band guy and I wanted to write orchestral music, and in the industry, it's really hard to break different grade levels too. Like I think he was writing for more basic ensembles, and then he wanted to move on to orchestras or even higher level. And that field is hard to break into once you're known as a composer. So this is something that I learned also about the industry as an educational music composer, that it's hard to even go through the different genres or even levels. But my question is also, I think one thing that we should cover is he also writes that he had written a piece that was in the Japanese style. What does that mean? Has he been to Japan? Has he kind of researched the music? And I'm not saying that because he's not Japanese, he shouldn't write in the Japanese style, but where was the impetus behind writing in a Japanese style, or what he describes as a Japanese style? I don't know what his understanding of Japanese style is. Should white male composers be writing Japanese, whatever that means, Japanese style music?
I feel like this might end up becoming one of my meta themes of this podcast, is that the devil's in the details. I mean, Kensho, the way that you framed the question was interesting because you said, has he researched Japanese music? Has he been to Japan? And to me, I do think that styles outside of one's own upbringing are valid for a composer outside of that cultural milieu to incorporate, to deal with, to be influenced by, if there is an authenticity about it. I mean, we all have different interests, and it's entirely possible that an older white guy could have gone to Japan or lived in Japan or spent time studying Japanese music and been inspired by that genuinely and want to integrate that somehow into his music.
I mean, this is something that I think about as a Japanese American conductor. Should I be conducting works by Brahms and Strauss or Villa-Lobos or anyone that's not outside of am I allowed to? Is that where we're going with this in terms of that, right? Because obviously having studied at a conservatory where mostly older European male composers are studied a lot, I have obviously some experience in studying and researching and having experience or having some kind of concrete experience with these composers. Thus, it's assumed that I can know something about their music and I can conduct it. But I would even guess that if I were to go to Austria and go and conduct my first Strauss piece, some people will be like, what is this Japanese American guy conducting this music? I'm sure that there are people that are going to question the validity of my style of conducting. Or, what business do I have conducting that kind of music? So it goes both ways too.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I recently watched a documentary from 1985 about Seiji Ozawa. And about halfway through, he's having lunch with Yo-Yo Ma. And they start to get into this discussion about, can an Oriental, quote unquote, to use Seiji Ozawa's words, be an authentic performer of Western classical music? And Seiji Ozawa at this point gets very flustered and very serious. And he tells the documentarians to turn off the cameras because he wants to have a real one-on-one with Yo-Yo Ma on this subject.
I mean, are we not in an age right now of questioning that very authority that has been basically granted as a matter of course in our studies? I mean, we go through conservatory training or music school training, affording a default status to the canon, which, as we acknowledged, is fairly homogenous in terms of race and geographical identity, we'll say. And are we not now in a point of reckoning where that authority that we've just thought of as a matter of course has been are we questioning that now? Like, is that not basically what the current moment is about?
When you think about the irony in this as well, and maybe this takes us way off course, but if you were to name the first name off your head name a Japanese composer, who would you name? Takemitsu, right?
Yeah, Toru Takemitsu.
Right, Toru Takemitsu. What does Takemitsu sound most closely to in terms of another composer with whom he may have studied? Messiaen. So if we're defining Japanese music as Takemitsu, we're already appropriating in a way that's like, okay, well, Japanese music sounds like French cosmic crazy music. I don't know. Like, is that what we're describing Japanese music is? Like, I don't know.
I think that the three of us would have that immediate association of Japanese music with Takemitsu, but most people wouldn't. Most people would think of like Joel Hisaishi, who is a major film and commercial music composer and has like a big following on YouTube and, big worldwide success story. So, that's particular, I think, to us.
Yet Larry Clark's music has nothing to do with either of those.
Well, let's talk about Larry Clark for a second, because I thought that it was interesting, and I did want to touch on this. The world of educational music is one of the few places where a composer actually has the opportunity to make a living from their work writing music. Mm-hmm. It's like there's film score and commercial music, and then there's writing for church choirs, and then there's writing music for schools, for bands and orchestras and choirs as well in schools. He should have been satisfied just to make his living from writing educational pieces. No, and I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that there is an actual profit motive here. Mm-hmm. Most composers who are just writing classical music, yes, of course, just praise heaven if they get any performance. Yep. Yeah, if you get a second performance of anything, you're so happy, right? Yeah. But in the world of educational music, there's actually money to be made here. True. And that's too why it is disturbing that he was the vice president and editor-in-chief of Carl Fischer Music while he was doing this, and he couldn't be satisfied. That's where you get the cynicism, right? Is if, in fact, what that first Facebook post said was true, that he was publishing under the pseudonym because of a desire for more diverse voices in the classroom and on school concert stages. And he couldn't see that it was enough, the success that he already had and the sales numbers that he already had. And that he had to say like, oh, well, nobody else is going to get this opportunity. This is for me too. That's the white fragility. And sorry if people don't like that term, but that really exposes white fragility in its most crass form.
The biggest thing that I learned from this is also this concept of state lists. They're basically just like a state-approved list of repertoire that schools can refer to program their concerts and also the festivals that, I'm assuming like all county and all state, all the stuff could probably refer to these lists, I'm assuming. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's very correct. And in fact, it shows I have to say, I've struggled with this too, because I have some music that's, that can easily be played by school level ensembles. And if you don't get on those state lists, that's a big hindrance. But even more than that, if you're not on like the vendor list in the school district, there are teachers who will say like, oh, I love that piece. I really want to do it. But, you're not through J.W. Pepper. So it's literally impossible for me to purchase your music and perform it.
It's funny that we talked about management earlier, but it's kind of the opposite effect here, where it's like you have to be with these bigger publishing companies. And you have to be also with the right publishing company to even have a shot at getting your music performed by an entire state, full of orchestras and schools. And these publishing companies, like I said at the opening, have a lot of power in determining what gets on these state lists, of course, because the schools are going to refer to those lists, and the people that arrange those lists are relying on the publishers to provide some recommendations. And here is Larry Clark at the center of it all, as editor-in-chief and vice president of a major publishing company, pushing his own pieces and Keiko Yamada's pieces, which were also his. It's just, that's a lot there.
I have another question for both of you. I don't know how often you have conversations with your colleagues, with our colleagues, about diversity of repertoire and trying to expand the range of things that we perform. But one thing that Jennifer Jolly has a few paragraphs about, the idea of quality and how that becomes a fallback argument for conductors, musicians who might be aware of the discourse and feel like they are being pressured to increase the diversity of voices that they are representing in their concert programs. And they always fall back, they say, yeah, but what really matters to me is quality. I get that there's this push and, we should maybe, bow down to representation to these voices sometimes. But, what I care about is musical quality. Have you guys heard that? Because I definitely have.
I'll speak to that in terms of the orchestra at large. I believe that there's less of a place to talk about this argument when you're talking about the professional field than there is in educational music. Because what you're thinking about, when professional orchestras say that they think that quality is what they've been doing and what, things that fall inside that lineage, then I can easily see that what, you end up with is something that Jennifer Jolly says in her article, which is that the word quality now is code for music that has been written by cisgender white males. And so that seems to hold water for me, because these organizations have, in general, resources to fund research and pay composers of color and underrepresented voices that would then be on the large stage. Now, as an educator, this seems much more difficult an argument for me. And I will say, Will, that I've not only encountered that, but I've thought it. And so if I may put myself in what I suppose will be a devil's advocate position, you are an overtaxed educator with a room full of 40, 50 kids who need repertoire tomorrow, and you have $100 or $0 budget to work with, and a state list that has been curated by other people that you are either restricted to or have no time/resources to go outside of. And you have a dozen broken strings on your first day, and you just cannot deal with it.
Well, absolutely, Tiffany. And I really would go as far as to say is that the onus is not on the teachers or people that are putting together this repertoire for their students, but it really falls on the publishers. The publishers need to do a better job, and the publishers need to be more aware of what the heck they're doing in terms of ensuring that there is diversity on these lists and making sure that the right composers have a voice and have a platform on which their music is performed. So that does it for our 3 topics of the week. Let's get to our classical mixtape segment. Tiffany, what do we have this week?
So in our classical mixtape, we make recommendations of things that have caught our ear over the last week. And I think first, Will, I'll go to you and ask, what have you been listening to this week?
Well, I really wanted to recommend something that a friend of mine, my friend Ellen, sent to me. This is a YouTube channel called Choir of Chias. That's choir spelled in the ancient Tudor manner, Quire. Here's the description from the YouTube channel. Choir of Chias is a unique one-person vocal ensemble featuring Philip Chia and his 3.5 octave range, which, quote unquote, defies the laws of nature, according to Time Out New York. So this is one of those sort of a cappella looking YouTube videos where, you know, you see the same person singing or playing multiple parts. But this guy is just so good, this Philip Chia. He's so impressive. I also love that he is always very nicely coiffed and presentable. He wears nice clothes. He often wears a tie. But he does a wide variety of music. He does a lot of Renaissance polyphony and Baroque music, but he does a very tasty selection of contemporary choral music as well. And so the one that I wanted to recommend is one of his most recent videos. It's How Do I Love Thee, Sonnet 43. And this is in fact a world premiere recording by the composer Alice B. Dearden.
Thanks, Will. I found actually, you know, I knew when that video came up on the screen that you were going to comment on the variety of nice ties, and because being nicely coiffed earns you a lot of points in Will White's book. So thanks for that excellent recommendation. He does have a phenomenal range. It's really something, right? Kensho, what have you got for us today?
Well, continuing in the vocal vein and also celebrating actual, real, live Asian or Asian American composers, women composers, I want to bring to your attention an excerpt from my friend Rene Orth, who's a wonderful composer, focusing mainly on opera. One of her first operas entitled Empty the House. And I had the chance to workshop this opera and do one of the first kind of concert performances of this piece. So obviously I'm a little bit biased, as a little disclaimer. But it's a wonderful story about basically a family of a single mother, a daughter, and a son. And the daughter is coming back to her home to help her mother move out. And a lot of these kind of issues from growing up reveal themselves, and it comes out that the mother also chased her son out of the house after discovering that he was gay. And he actually, Paul, the son, passes away from AIDS. and the mother has to come to terms with how that all happened. And Paul appears in the opera as a ghost or just a presence in the house that's not actually interacting with the other characters on stage. And the excerpt that I'm playing for you is Paul's final aria to his mother at the end of the opera, and so I wanted to bring that clip today for you. The aria is sung by Denis Chmielewski, and is a performance from the Curtis Opera Theater with the Curtis Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Daniela Candelari.
Thanks for the great recommendation, Kensho. I also decided, in the vein of this podcast, to feature a composer that I had the good fortune of performing a work by her a couple years ago. Her name is Karen Tanaka, and she is a living Japanese, I guess she's Japanese American. She was born in Tokyo, but now teaches in California at Cal Arts. And she has a number of interesting projects to her name, not the least of which is going to be that she served as orchestrator in 2016 for the BBC TV series Planet Earth 2. So I thought that was a cool credential that's in her bio. But the two, I'm actually going to do a double recommendation today. The first is a piece that I think everyone is going to glom onto immediately. It's a piece called Enchanted Forest for solo horn and piano. And I'm recommending probably the only real commercial recording of this piece, which is by a horn player called Nobuaki Fukugawa and pianist Yuri Miura. That's Miura. You need to know nothing about this piece really other than the name, right? Which is Enchanted Forest. It's got this gorgeous soundscape, it's very lush, and it's got three movements that have kind of three different aspects of being in the forest. I really think that it's something quite special, and that more horn players, if you're looking for repertoire, this is a great selection for you. For the slightly more adventurous listeners, I'll recommend to you a slightly more avant-garde piece for 5 instruments that's called Invisible Curve. I'll recommend the only real commercial recording of it, which is by the Azure Ensemble, which you can find on YouTube, and we'll link you in the show notes. But also, I'm proud to note that if actually you search this piece on YouTube, the first result that comes up is actually the performance that I conducted of this. So those are my recommendations for this week. That completes our listening recommendations for this week. You'll find the links to all of these as well as to our entire classical mixtape playlist on YouTube in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I have been your host this week, William White, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe, I'd like to thank you all so much for listening and to encourage you to help spread the word about the show, to subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, because it really does help. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com or on our Instagram or Facebook pages, The Classical Gabfest. And here's a question. If people do sign up for one of our social media feeds, are they just going to get boring clips of this same old boring podcast, or what? You guys are the social media people.
All the Easter eggs.
All the Easter eggs, Illuminati references, and maybe a small clip of Bedtime Story with Will.
Anyway, we'd love to hear from you however you get in touch with us. And until next time, happy listening, and we will be back with you next week.